Welcome, everyone, to the PFF Fantasy Podcast. I'm John Macri, and I am once again joined by PFF's lead fantasy analyst, Nate, the great Jahnke. Nate, we're live once again on the YouTubes and out into the Twitterverse. We're heading into week 10. We've reached the double-digit weeks now, but we also got the NFL trade deadline today. It happens at 4 o'clock Eastern time. Maybe we'll get some more exciting trades to break down live on the pod, but we already got a couple this morning with North America's team, the Detroit Lions, acquiring edge defender Zadarius Smith from the Cleveland Browns in a nice tidy piece of work to help with their pass rush. And Justin as well, one of the players that we talked about last week as a potential trade candidate, and one that was on the list again this week, and we'll talk about Khalil Herbert, has been traded from the Chicago Bears to the Cincinnati Bengals. So we'll talk about all of that here in just a second. Exciting stuff, obviously, already. But first off, how are you doing here on this trade deadline day?
I'm doing well. We had the overtime game last night. I lost my guillotine league and clinched a spot in the Scott Fish Bowl within 2 plays during overtime. Had it not gone into overtime, neither of those would have happened, but it was okay because I saw Ryan Miller having a good game, and he caught his 1 pass for his 1 touchdown. So I profited off that, but it was good that happened before it got to overtime. So I was at least happy before I got very stressed out in that 1 drive for Kansas City.
Nice. Yeah, the Kareem Hunt touchdown at the end won me a couple leagues on that final play as well. So that was, the overtime definitely helped. But yeah, this will be fun to kind of break down here. We're going to talk about the trade, like I said, in just a second. But for anybody watching along or listening, you can always check out Nate's waiver wire article over on PFF.com as well. You could get access to that, along with the many other valuable tools and resources with a PFF Plus subscription. So make sure to check that out there. And then obviously we're live. Feel free to ask questions in the chat, and we'll try to get to them here as we go through our list and as they make sense. So right away, see a question about wide receivers. We'll probably cover that maybe when we get to the wide receiver sections. And that's kind of how we'll treat the questions here. So just be patient and we will get to it, I promise. All right, Nate, let's start with the breaking news of Khalil Herbert being traded to the Cincinnati Bengals. He was on the list a little bit further down in that potential trade candidate area, but now it's official. So what are your initial thoughts on this move for the Bengals backfield? And any and all compliments on my quick graphic design work here is also welcome.
Yes, well done getting the trade up there and having the alert signals. So that's all good. The Bengals, definitely an interesting destination for Khalil Herbert. First and foremost, it probably means Zach Moss might not come back at all this season. It sounded like indefinite was the word that they used, so that's always not a great sign. The Bengals backfield last week looked very much how it looked for several years in Cincinnati, with Chase Brown kind of having that Joe Mixon role, and then them having different backs for third down. We saw Travion Williams. We saw their tight end Drew Sample play on third downs, and that's something we saw a lot last year. So that's what it reminded me of. With Herbert there, it probably means that they don't want Chase Brown to run the ball 20 plus times a game going forward. So that's noteworthy. I think that'll probably be a 2-man rotation in the backfield, because Herbert also is not a third down back. That's not what his role has been in Chicago. He did do it at times a year ago, but I don't think that's necessarily his strength. So I think it'll probably be Brown might still be able to be a starter. I think Herbert's worth picking up just to see what his role is going to be, and just because the running back waiver wire targets aren't the greatest this week. So I think there's a chance Herbert can have a big role, but he's also could just be the backup to Chase Brown and only comes in here and there when Brown needs a break.
Yeah, it was nice to see Chase Brown dominate the touches, obviously, and the news of Zach Moss obviously being out indefinitely was good news for Brown originally. This one, yeah, it does seem like we'll probably get some Khalil Herbert mixed in. I don't know if it'll happen maybe this week. They play on a short week as well. They play on Thursday Night Football, the Bengals, right? So maybe we get another week of Chase Brown dominating the backfield touches there as Khalil Herbert kind of gets eased into the offense. But yeah, for week I guess what it'll be week 11 and beyond, there will probably be a little bit more Khalil Herbert there, but it doesn't seem to change much for the Bears either, right? Like they didn't really use Khalil Herbert at all. So if anything, it just means that those Bears running backs don't have to kind of look over their shoulder at the potential of Khalil Herbert coming in, but didn't seem like that was going to be the case anyways here. So that is the Khalil Herbert trade.
One more thought on the Bengals. It's worth noting they have one of the worst schedules for running backs the rest of the way. They also have a bye week in week 12. So if you do add Herbert, you're probably going to have to be patient with him because he's probably not going to do much this week. Like you said, they have a rough matchup the week after that. Then they have the bye week. So it's probably going to be almost 4 weeks until we see any significant role out of Herbert in the offense. And then agree with you with the Bears. He's been inactive the last 2 weeks. So he wasn't seeing any playing time.
Yeah. All right. So we'll go into kind of our regular waiver wire targets here. And just like last week, our running back pickings off the waiver wire are slim, to say the least. So our targets are very kind of handcuff centric here in week 10 for the position. And you've listed off a few names who are available in over 75% of ESPN leagues right now, all in very kind of similar positions essentially as the next man up. So, should something happen to their starters ahead of them on the depth chart, we're looking at Blake Corum of the Los Angeles Rams, Braylon Allen of the New York Jets, Trey Benson of the Arizona Cardinals, Isaac Guerendo of the San Francisco 49ers, and Kenneth Gainwell of the Philadelphia Eagles. All handcuffs, all starters are currently healthy. But Nate, if you have the roster space and don't have anyone else to add, taking a shot on one of these guys just in case could be valuable if the injuries start up again.
Yeah, the one exception to that group is Guerendo. I know Mason and McCaffrey, it both sounded like they would be practicing to start the week. So pretty unlikely that Guerendo ends up being the starter, but both running backs are dealing with starting running backs have been dealing with injuries. So there is at least a small chance Guerendo ends up being the starter this week. And that's the only reason he's on the list, because he is the one player who is available on the waiver wire that has at least a small chance of starting this week. Outside of that, like you said, it's handcuffs. The other 4 guys all here because their schedule is very good for running backs the rest of the way. And we think if the starter were to get injured, that the backup would see significant playing time. I will note, if you look at other people's waiver wire targets at running back, a lot of people included Ray Davis on the list. Davis, another one of these handcuffs, but the schedule for the Bills is not nearly as good as the schedule for the Rams, Jets, Cardinals, and Eagles. So that's why Davis isn't included on the list. If you looked at all of the running backs available on the waiver wire and how good they did last week, obviously Davis did the best. He had, I think it was a reception for 50 plus yards. So he had a very good stat line, but his role has been exactly the same throughout the entire season for the Bills. Anytime that they're winning and have a decent lead, Davis mixes in more. Anytime it's a competitive game where the Bills maybe are losing, Davis doesn't see all that much playing time, just whenever James Cook needs a break. It just happened to be this past week that when Cook needed a break, Davis had a very good play. So nothing has really changed for the Bills. So I don't see Davis having a huge role going forward, and the Bills still have a number of tough matchups on the schedule. So Davis is still worth considering just in case James Cook gets injured, but there's these other running backs that we have on the list that I think would be more valuable if their lead running backs were to get injured.
Yeah, I'm with you. And then, like you said, with the 49ers too, it did sound like they were pretty optimistic that Christian McCaffrey was going to play in week 10 as well. So Jordan Mason, who knows, obviously he's left a couple games here with an injury, but there's potential that we get McCaffrey back, and, Guerendo wouldn't be necessarily all that valuable, but like you said, there's at least a small chance there. And then, everything else, I mean, all kind of handcuffs right now. But then we do have one other name who was on our potential trade candidate list. Maybe this one will happen during the podcast. That'll be fun. But we had Khalil Herbert in this group as well. But it's just Miles Sanders all by himself right now, just waiting, hoping to be traded here. Rostered in about 8% of ESPN leagues. If someone goes out of their way to acquire them, like they did with Khalil Herbert, Nate, what do you think? Any inkling on whether we see a Sanders trade as well today?
I think it's at least possible. It's a little bit more difficult for him just because of his contract, where Herbert's contract was a lot easier to work with. The Panthers, it does sound like Jonathan Brooks is expected to return this upcoming week. So that will push Miles Sanders potentially to third on the depth chart. There's at least a chance that Brooks is just eased in a little bit to start with. But Panthers don't need Miles Sanders on the roster. I don't think he's part of the long-term plan. Chuba Hubbard's looked good throughout the season. And hopefully Jonathan Brooks ends up looking good once he's closer to 100%. So Sanders is probably the running back that makes the most sense to get traded at some point today. A couple destinations, Dallas, even though Rico Dowdle had a good game, they could use a second running back, and Miles Sanders could be that guy. The Raiders have been very inconsistent at running back throughout the entire season. It doesn't seem like anyone on the roster currently is the answer. And with the change in offensive coordinator and everything, there's a chance that they decide they need a new running back. At least a couple other options here and there. But I think if anyone were to get traded, it would be Sanders. But it's also worth noting that today is the trade deadline day. So at this point, ideally, you don't have to make your waiver claims until later today after the trade deadline is done. So you'll be able to know if Sanders is on a new team or not by the time you have to make your waiver claims. I know a number of leagues, you are able to pick up players earlier than that, in which case maybe pick up Sanders. And if he's not traded, just drop him later today. But that's where I'm at with Sanders.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Yeah, we'll see. I mean, Dallas, I think they're couple games under 500 now, right? And they potentially lost Dak Prescott, right? So who knows if they'll be buying. But like you said, I mean, they could use the help because it doesn't seem like Ezekiel Elliott is maybe necessarily going to be on the team. Who knows? I wouldn't be surprised if he's cut after being a healthy scratch too last week for missing meetings or whatever it was. And then Raiders, man, I don't know if they should be trying to buy right now, but, but we'll see what happens there. Because, like you said, their backfield hasn't been great either. And then our last waiver wire target here on the running back list before we get into a running back question is Keaton Mitchell, Nate, who had his practice window open, and apparently he has a chance to play in week 10. Obviously, he's not going to overtake Derrick Henry, but maybe could work his way into like a handcuff role if he looks good coming back.
Yeah, he was a full participant in practice over the last week, so I think they just wanted to give him another week just to get him more fully up to speed, which is perfectly fine. A lot of times when people open up the practice window, it does help them with their roster as well, because they don't have to put him on the 53-man roster while he's practicing, which is always nice for the team. And they are in no rush for Mitchell to return. So not concerned at all about the length it's taken for them to put him back on the 53-man roster, but good to see him as a full participant in practice. Even if it's not this week, then it'll probably be the week after that he's on the 53-man roster. Would expect him to be the primary handcuff, Justice Hill, primarily a receiving back. He has been the primary handcuff to Baltimore because even with Mitchell out, they've had other issues with their third running back spot with players injured and whatnot. So Hill has been the primary backup to Henry, but I don't think that would be the case once Mitchell is back. I'd expect Mitchell to be the handcuff. And if something were to happen to Derrick Henry at some point this season, I would expect Mitchell to take Derrick Henry's role and Justice Hill to largely just remain in Justice Hill's role.
Gotcha. And then just a quick question here from Harry Brooks on the YouTube. In PPR, should I hold on to Rachaad White or drop him for Jonathan Brooks or Isaiah Pacheco? So we mentioned Jonathan Brooks potentially coming back, depending on, maybe it's this week or next week. But Isaiah Pacheco, we know, still dealing with the leg injury, not necessarily going to be back this week, but we expect him back at some point this season. I know Rachaad White, his usage has been kind of up and down. He's also been up and down as an inefficient back, but scored a touchdown last night. So do you have a preference here for Rachaad White, Brooks, or Pacheco rest of season?
I think a lot depends on where your team is at this point in the season. If it looks like you are pretty clearly going to make the playoffs and don't have to worry about that, then I would be fine dropping White for one of these other running backs, because I think Brooks and Pacheco have more upside, probably leaning more towards Pacheco, especially if you're fairly confident you can make the fantasy playoffs. But if you are still trying to reach the playoffs, I think White's going to have more value over this next month and can help you at least get to the playoffs. So somewhat depends on your other running backs as well, if White's someone who sometimes starts for you or not, or if he's just been sitting on your bench this entire time. But I think Brooks and Pacheco both have more upside once we get to December. There's certainly a chance that Brooks just remains a backup running back this entire time, but I don't see White getting to a point where he is playing 75% of snaps like he was last season again. So I think his upside is limited, where Pacheco could go straight back to the Pacheco role. Brooks could be as good as we thought he'd be coming out of college. And so either one of them could be top 10, top 15 backs, where I don't see White reaching a top 15 back this season on a consistent basis, at least.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense. And then, like you said, too, like for the short term, I think Rashad White obviously is the most clear path to fantasy production. And I mean, even if Brooks is back this week, like there's a pretty good chance that they ease him in as well, right? Especially considering how long they've taken to activate him, and coming off the ACL, still a rookie. They're not in contention here, and Chuba Hubbard's played really well as well. So wouldn't be surprised to see a few more weeks until Jonathan Brooks really starts to have a significant role. But that's our running backs. We'll move on to the wide receivers here in just a second. But first, I wanted to let you know we have an ad from DraftKings Pick 6. The best part of football season, checking out the post-game stats, which wideouts scored more than 2 touchdowns, which quarterbacks threw for less than 350 yards. Think you can pick who will do what before kickoff, then play Pick 6 from DraftKings, an official daily fantasy partner of the NFL. Download the DraftKings Pick 6 app. Select between 2 and 6 players and choose if they'll have more or less of a stat. It's that simple. And for all first-time Pick 6 players, check this out. New customers play $5 on your first pick set, get $50 in Pick 6 credits. Download the new DraftKings Pick 6 app now and use code PFF. That's code PFF for new customers to play $5 on your first pick set, get $50 in Pick 6 credits only on DraftKings Pick 6. The crown is yours. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Help is available for problem gambling. Call 888-789-7777 or visit ccpg.org. In Connecticut, must be 18 plus, age and eligibility restrictions vary by jurisdiction. Pick 6 not available everywhere, including New York and Ontario. Void where prohibited. One per new customer. Non-withdrawable Pick 6 credits expire in 6 months. Limited time offer. See terms at DraftKings, or see terms at pick6.draftkings.com/promos. Okay, let's move on to the wide receivers now, where we have much more options to choose from than the running backs, obviously. And the first name on the list is the same as last week. It's Cedric Tillman of the Cleveland Browns. He had another really productive game, bringing in 6 of 11 targets for 75 yards and a touchdown. Nate, seems we got Jameis's wide receiver 1.
Yeah, it looks like he's been the top wide receiver on the team. The other wide receivers have been getting a lot of targets as well, but Tillman has been the consistent top player these past 3 weeks now. It was especially impressive this past week going up against the Los Angeles Chargers. The Chargers, typically a good team at stopping wide receivers from fantasy production, so that was very good to see. In general, I haven't, even though Tillman is the top wide receiver on this list, he has been for a little bit of time now, and probably won't be next week. I'm assuming his rostership will reach over 50% by that time. The Browns do have a very difficult schedule for wide receivers the rest of the way, but Tillman did just show that he can be productive against one of the other top teams against wide receivers. So a chance that Tillman continues to be very productive, but I also think there is a chance that he could struggle down the line. So I also, in my 5555 article, have him as someone to consider selling high on, because of that schedule and a chance that he just isn't as productive going up against better cornerbacks than he was at least the first 2 weeks that he was the starter.
Yeah, I'm with you. He's been really productive these past 2 weeks. 19 targets, 174 yards, 3 touchdowns. Those are all top 10 for the position for wide receivers over the last 2 weeks. 1.83 yards per out run, solid. Maybe he could keep it going, but like you said, that schedule does get tougher. And after seeing bad Jameis show up this week, there are at least some questions about how sustainable it'll be here for Tillman. So let's go on to the first-round rookie wide receiver Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers scored another touchdown this week, Nate, despite just 33 receiving yards, but led the team in targets, and it is a team that is in need of a leading wide receiver. And the hope is that Legette can be that guy.
Yeah, has been on this list for a while now, but has moved all the way up to number 2. 2 different reasons for that. One, the schedule for the rest of the way fairly favorable for the Panthers, so that should be helpful for Legette. And then the other thing is they did trade Deontay Johnson away, so that certainly helps open the door for more consistent targets for the other wide receivers. Jalen Coker was the other wide receiver in Carolina that we were a little worried about and thought maybe there was a chance Coker would be the number one wide receiver based on how well he had been playing. But in this game, Leggett went back to being a clear every down starter, both 11 and 12 personnel, where Coker was basically only playing in 11 personnel for a lot of the game. So that meant Leggett had a lot more playing time, a lot more routes run, which was good to see. And then Adam Thielen, he is another player who could get traded today. But if he's not traded, then Thielen will likely go back to being in the slot, which would mean a lot less playing time for Coker. So I think out of the two, it seems pretty clear that Leggett is the player that will get more opportunities going forward. So that's why he is all the way up here on the list.
Yeah, no, I don't know why Coker was splitting time with like Jonathan Mingo when one guy has flash potential while the other has not. But still, yeah, optimistic about Coker for dynasty purposes, but maybe not necessarily for this season. And then next up is another touchdown scorer from this past week. And I would say one of my favorite Fox touchdown cartoon headshots so far. It's Ray McCloud of the Atlanta Falcons. He's more than just a great cartoon headshot, Nate.
Oh, yeah, he is. Throughout the time with the Atlanta Falcons, the Falcons are running more 11 personnel than any other team this season, running it over 90% of the time. So McLeod is on the field at least 90% of plays. And it's also a situation where they aren't rotating their wide receivers at all. It's always the same wide receivers on the field. It makes what I'm doing charting of who's on the field a lot easier, but it also means that I'm almost never tweeting out Falcons wide receiver snap counts because there's nothing interesting going on there most of the time. But McLeod, Drake London suffered an injury this past week, which means he wasn't there to take as many targets. I think there is at least a chance that London misses a game. It doesn't sound like it's going to be a long-term injury, so that's good to see at least. It was Kaderil Hodge who ended up seeing more playing time in place of Drake London, but I think if I were to take an Atlanta wide receiver off the waiver wire, McLeod would be the player that I'd be targeting, and they do have a favorable matchup against the Saints this week, so particularly if you are looking for a wide receiver this week and Cedric Tillman is not an option for you, then McLeod would be the wide receiver that I target.
Yeah, I mean, I know you just had the 3 targets, but at least playing like 90% of the snaps, which you said, which is, I mean, a lot more than could be said for like Kyle Pitts, for example, who was like 53%. But, you know, that's a conversation for another day. At least Ray, you know, has a role in a good offense for now. And like you said, we'll have to see what goes on with Drake London, but there is something at least to be optimistic about for McLeod. We did get a quick question here, Nate. The people want to know, do you play in an IDP league? I know you do, but can you let them know that you are an ally of IDP here?
Definitely. I'm in an IDP league. I think multiple IDP leagues, and I believe in the top 10 in Fantasy Pros ranking competition in IDP accuracy so far this season, and typically have been most years. I think consistently the most accurate person on Fantasy Pros who ranks every position, including kicker, defense, and IDP. So I mostly let John take care of all the IDP content and everything because that's too much for me to write about both offense and defense and everything. But I do play in IDP leagues, yes.
There you go, fantasy sports. Yeah, I appreciate Nate leaving the IDP stuff for me. I don't do the Fantasy Pros rankings, but I am very happy to see that you are doing well in there. And let's keep going here. On to Quentin Johnston of the Los Angeles Chargers, 2023 first round pick. Obviously, you know, had a really poor rookie season. But he's been a lot better this season, has now doubled his rookie year touchdown total with 4 here in 2024, and even went up over 100 receiving yards for the first time, Nate. So things are looking up for QJ, maybe.
Yeah, he was on the list earlier this season and then was injured out for a couple weeks. So we kind of forgot about Johnston a little bit. And in one of those games, he saw his playing time dip a little bit. But this game, it was still somewhat of a rotation. The Chargers had more wide receivers back this week. I think interesting thing is DJ Chark. I don't know exactly what's going on with him. He had been practicing. He had been a full participant in practice. And then he wasn't active this week after getting activated to the 53-man roster. Don't know if he just needs a little bit more time or if he's just that far down the Chargers depth chart. But there is at least a chance that Chark comes back and starts rotating with Johnston even more, which won't be good to see. But Johnston keeps on scoring touchdowns. Like you said, his first 100-yard game So there's a chance that he has turned things around. So definitely worth picking up just to see what he does over the rest of the season. Hopefully he becomes consistent enough that we can consider starting him. But I think he's just a young player who could do well over the rest of the season. And really, with the waiver wire this week, that's what a lot of these players are. Is there weren't too many players that really stood out and are like, okay, I need to put him in my starting lineup now. Just a lot of guys who could do something over the rest of the year.
Yeah, I mean, there could be a role there, right? Like you said, we know like McConkey, kind of the high volume target earner, but there's definitely like some big play potential in Quentin Johnston, and you never know, maybe they can get some use out of him in the red zone as well as like a bigger body. It hasn't really been the case so far, but could be some good usage to get out of a potential or a former first round wide receiver. Next up is a name that has remained on the list for the past few weeks, Nate. It's Juju Smith-Schuster of the Kansas City Chiefs, who are coming off that Monday Night Football overtime victory, which they did without Juju, who was inactive with the hamstring injury again. So we haven't seen him since week 5. I know he's someone we were liking maybe for more of that slot wide receiver role. So does that role still look available to him for when he returns?
I think it is at least available to him. I think the Kansas City Chiefs, we saw their wide receivers last night. They were not rotating their wide receivers nearly as much as we have seen in the past. They largely stuck with DeAndre Hopkins, Xavier Worthy, and Justin Watson. And the three were rotating a lot of who was in the slot. Basically, all three of them saw roughly 2/3 of their snaps on the outside, 1/3 of their snaps in the slot. So they did not have a clear slot receiver. Hopkins playing 1/3 of the snaps in the slot is a lot for him. And he did have, I think it was one catch for 35 yards from a play from the slot. But Hopkins, for the most part, was in the X receiver role, which is something that we've seen from him throughout his career. And Patrick Mahomes threw to him more in the X receiver role than he has ever thrown to an X receiver during his time in Kansas City. Had 6 receptions when he was lined up on the outside on the line of scrimmage, which is more than any other Kansas City wide receiver since 2018 in the game. So it seems like they are happy adjusting their offense for Hopkins and putting Hopkins in a place where he succeeds, which is not necessarily in the slot. So I do think there is the opportunity for Smith-Schuster to return to that role and see significant playing time. I would expect Justin Watson to lose out on a number of snaps, and the Chiefs still rotate their wide receivers at times. They did use a lot of 2 tight end sets, and because of that, at least one wide receiver was off the field decently consistently. So he would be part of a rotation. I think all of them would be part of a rotation, even Hopkins. And I think Smith-Schuster would still see a very high percentage of his snaps in the slot because no one else is. And because of that, he could still see a lot of targets, even with Hopkins there and playing well.
Gotcha. Yeah, and speaking of Hopkins, we did get a question from Skywalker. I don't know if it's Anakin, Luke, Ray, but he wants to know what do you make of like Hopkins' performance? Do you think that's going to be something that continues rest of season here? Obviously, this is a rest of season ranking. I know you haven't updated that here for this week necessarily just yet, but any quick thoughts on whether you'd prefer DeAndre Hopkins over Chris Olave, Zay Flowers, or Devontae Smith?
I think Devontae Smith is the only one that I would have ahead right now. Olave just very concerned about his concussion history and how long he'll be out for. I know he said he's fine, but fine in terms of not having to be in the hospital anymore is different than fine being able to play football again in the near future. So I think with Olave, it's very much wait and see. Zay Flowers, he did have that really good game, but I am concerned about Deontay Johnson getting more playing time in Baltimore, especially some of that coming at the expense of Flowers. Flowers saw a lot fewer snaps in this game than he had in the past. A lot of that happened after the Ravens had a lead, but if anyone is going to lose snaps with Deontay Johnson taking more snaps, it very well could be Flowers. But I am still high on Devontae Smith. Hopkins in general, probably going to trust him in fantasy starting lineups going forward. There will probably be a couple weeks where it's just Travis Kelce getting a lot of passes. Smith-Schuster will get a couple. The Chiefs will get a lead. They can run the ball the rest of the game. They might not need Hopkins much in some of those games. So I would still be happy to put him in my fantasy lineup, just knowing there will be a couple weeks where he might not produce very much.
Nice. Love it. All right, Nate, you've got Darius Slayton of the New York Giants on the list this week. Slayton, relatively quiet game in week 9 on the box score, but you think there's some rest of season potential here for Darius Slayton?
Oh, yeah, his target share has remained relatively high, despite Malik Neighbors returning. Teams double teaming Neighbors, which makes it easier for Slayton. He is in the concussion protocol right now, so there is a chance he might miss this upcoming week. But the Giants do have one of the best schedules over the rest of the year, basically for their entire offense, for the run game, for their pass game, just a lot of defenses who allow a lot of fantasy points. So that's a big reason why Slayton is here. Is he's not just one of the most consistent producers among those available on the waiver wire, but also the schedule. His name has been linked in trades before. There is at least a chance he gets traded. But if that does happen, it's ideally to a team that wants him and is going to use him this year. So even if he does get traded, he probably still would be on this list.
Gotcha. All right, another wide receiver who had a chance to play on Monday Night Football last night, but he was inactive this time for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. It's rookie Jalen McMillan. The Bucs obviously still without Mike Evans for a little longer, and obviously Chris Godwin done for the year. So there's room for McMillan to have some fantasy value if he can get back healthy here, Nate.
Yeah, spent a lot of time trying to figure out the Tampa Bay wide receiver room last night just for them to combine for like 2 or 3 catches outside of Shepard's 4. Right. And Shepard was limited last night with his injury as well. I basically think McMillan will continue to be the Z receiver for Tampa Bay the rest of the season as long as he's healthy. A little bit concerned with Raheem Jarrett. They seem pretty excited about him. He won a starting job completely this past week, so a chance that once everyone is healthy, we could see Mike Evans back to his X receiver role, Sterling Shepard playing in the slot, which would mean McMillan and potentially Jarrett are rotating for that role. But there's also a chance that if they like Jarrett in that role, McMillan could finally play some in the slot, potentially over Sterling Shepard. So I think it's pretty up in the air how Tampa Bay is going to end up using their wide receivers over the rest of the season, outside of Mike Evans once he's healthy. But I think McMillan, out of the other receivers, probably has the most upside. So at least worth considering at this point.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I mean, like you said, outside of Evans, it's a group of guys that, maybe on any given week they could be, the second receiver on that team. But if you're looking rest of season kind of thing, I think McMillan makes the most sense here, right? As the rookie 2nd round pick, if he can get healthy and back in the lineup here. But we do have another rookie wide receiver up next. Also didn't play this week, but that's because his team was on a bye. It's Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers, who are still dealing with injuries to their wide receiver core. Obviously none bigger than Brandon Ayuk being done for the year. So it's one of those situations where maybe Pearsall can have a big role, but then, maybe not either way. One of the better speculative ads here, Nate, especially considering the health of the 49ers wide receivers as of late.
Oh, yeah, that pretty well covers it. He's been a slot receiver in the games that he has played this season. He has played a little bit on the outside, but it's mostly been when other wide receivers have been injured. So a chance when everyone's healthy, he could be even just a rotational player in the slot because Juwan Jennings could also be rotating in the slot with him. So we don't really know what his role is going to be once everyone is healthy, but just the fact that they drafted him so highly, you probably want to see what he can do going forward, would expect him to see at least some playing time. And it's in an offense that's scoring a lot of points. So while some of these other younger receivers, I might not be as excited about them when their role isn't as known because it's the 49ers offense, I'm more willing to take a chance on a player who might just be a rotational player.
Yep, that's fair. Our next wide receiver is for the Los Angeles Rams and has more receiving touchdowns over the past 2 weeks than any other player with 4. It's Demarcus Robinson, who had to step up after Puka Nacua got ejected in week 9. But any hope for Demarcus Robinson to maintain that kind of fantasy value rest of season, Nate?
I'm a bit skeptical, but it's hard not to include him after he's done so well these past 2 weeks. His role has been exactly the same throughout the entire season. He's been their X receiver, even when there's been injuries to some of these receivers and guys going in and out. His role has been the one constant thing for the Rams wide receivers this entire season. we were thinking at the start of the season that he would be someone to draft because if a wide receiver went down, he would get a higher target share, and both wide receivers went down and his target share didn't increase. And now that the wide receivers are back, he's finally scoring touchdowns again, which was a big part of his fantasy value at the end of last year. So I think it's fine to pick him up. I don't know when I would feel comfortable putting him in my starting lineup because he is so dependent on touchdowns and not seeing a high target share. But there are certainly some leagues that are big enough where you're maybe starting 4 wide receivers that you would be consider starting him in those leagues where you might not start him in a league where you're only starting 3 wide receivers. So there are definitely some leagues where Robinson will have a lot of value because you probably don't have that many options of who you're starting at wide receiver. But in most normal leagues, I probably would just leave him on the waiver wire.
Yeah, he's a tricky one because we've seen other guys step up too, like the Jordan Whittingtons and Tyler Johnsons of the world. So who knows, even with a potential injury, like if Puka Nacua or Cooper Kupp misses time again, but we'll have to, at least consider him as one of those names here that could mix in a pretty good passing offense. Noah Brown of the Washington Commanders is next up after leading the Commanders in receiving this week, and he didn't need a Hail Mary touchdown to get it done, but he's been really efficient this season, and there could be more where that came from as a team that needs a secondary receiving option to step up here, Nate.
Yeah, typically I try to make sure that I'm including at least 2 wide receivers, 2 running backs that are available in at least 90% of ESPN leagues. For a lot of this season, it's kind of just happened naturally. I haven't had to go searching for guys to include them. But Noah Brown, even before the week started, was the guy that I thought I'd be including in this area. He has just consistently been playing well for the Commanders. It took him a little bit to get to the starting lineup because he joined the team later in the offseason. And then he also was dealing with an injury at one point, but he is playing very well. I think averaging over 2 yards per route run, and nearly every other wide receiver who's averaging 2 yards per route run on any kind of large sample size is typically a fantasy starter in leagues, and at least everyone else is already on fantasy rosters. So Brown is at least playing very well compared to the other wide receivers on the waiver wire. The only difficult part is Washington does like rotating their wide receivers in and out a lot. They do have a lot of options. They have Terry McLaurin, Zach Ertz is playing well and at tight end, and they do like running the ball when they have the opportunity to. So a lot of mouths to feed in Washington, but I think Brown is at least worth considering with how well he's playing.
Gotcha. Okay, one more wide receiver to cover here before we get into some of the wide receiver questions. It's another touchdown scorer actually from this past week, and a touchdown scorer in 4 straight. Nick Westbrook-Akine of the Tennessee Titans on a touchdown streak, Nate.
Yeah, started the season as their 5th wide receiver, but then they traded DeAndre Hopkins, and Treylon Burks is on injured reserve. Not sure how much longer he'll be out for, but because of that, Westbrook-Akine has gone from basically a rotational player throughout his career, consistently seeing a couple hundred yards each season. He is a clear starter for Tennessee right now, and he's consistently scoring touchdowns. And the Titans are one of those couple of teams that have a very favorable schedule over the rest of the way in terms of their passing offense at the very least. So a lot of favorable matchups for Westbrook-Akine. So not someone that I am super excited for starting in a lot of leagues, but I am in some deeper leagues where both together in a 32-team league where he helped me win my matchup this week. I'm in a dynasty league where I can start 6 wide receivers, and I have him there as well. So even though the vast majority of leagues, you're probably not looking to pick him up, if you're in some of these crazier leagues like John and I are in, he is someone worth considering in those kind of leagues.
Yeah, I mean, we'd definitely take that streak that he's been on there, and yeah, who knows, maybe the Tennessee offense could start playing a little bit better as well, but it's allowed him at least to score a touchdown in 4 straight here as the next man up kind of thing. But we do have some wide receiver questions here. Josh Downs has been a popular name in the questions quickly. We talked about him last week. He didn't make the cut this week just because he's rostered in over 50% of leagues now, but let's focus on the Josh Downs questions first, because he's obviously available here in quite a few leagues. So who is this? Sifter 132 asks, apologize, just joined, if we covered Josh Downs already, but would you put Josh Downs over the wide receivers, I guess, that we discussed here already today, or where would he fit in?
Oh yeah, definitely would be the top wide receiver. He's taken in over 70% of ESPN leagues, so that's why he wasn't included. So not available in a lot more leagues compared to the wide receivers. We talked about here, but Downs has just been very consistent. He's been their slot receiver. This week was a little weird in that the Colts were using a lot more two tight end sets. I believe it was just a matchup based thing. I think they were doing it as part of the game plan against their opponent, but how they used Downs didn't change this past week. They consistently had him on the field in 11 personnel, did not have him on the field in two wide receiver sets. That has been true for the Colts for the past two seasons. So I'm not concerned about Downs based on last week and his lower amount of playing time than usual. Still think he will maintain a high target share for the rest of the season. And I think they'll go back to using more 11 personnel in their future matchups as well. So I'm happy with Downs. I even, despite last week, had him go up my rest of season rankings.
Nice. And then the other Josh Downs related question here from Fantasy Sports: hold or drop Jalen Waddle for, I guess, a lot of the names that we talked about today: Cedric Tillman, Quentin Johnston, Josh Downs obviously being at the top of the list, Xavier Legette, and then Juwan Jennings, who we didn't discuss. Obviously, he's been injured here, but would you prefer Josh Downs or Juwan Jennings, I guess, over Jalen Waddle here?
I think Downs is the only one I would consider. I think Waddle still has the most upside. He's graded so well in the past that I'm still not giving up on Waddle at this point. We've seen Tua back for 2 weeks now. Even though Waddle's target share hasn't increased significantly, Tua has been playing a lot better and the offense has been playing better. I do think there's a chance that Waddle starts to get more involved, where Downs has been just a consistent sees a lot of targets each week, is going to continue seeing that high target share. I don't think he's someone who's going to be a potential top 10 wide receiver, where I do think Waddle still has that top 10 potential. So it depends what you need at wide receiver. If you just need that consistent starter, then stick with Downs. But if you are more so looking for a higher upside player, then I would stick with Waddle.
Yeah. And then, I mean, I guess same question. It's Chris Olave over Josh Downs. We know we got Josh Downs ahead of the rest of our waiver wire wide receivers. Chris Olave dealing with the concussion again, which obviously, like we said before, concerning, even though he's out of the hospital. But would you prefer Josh Downs over Chris Olave at this point?
I mean, ideally, we hear some news about what they plan on doing with him if he starts to practice at all, how soon he gets out of the concussion protocol, if they put him on injured reserve. I'm probably holding on to Olave unless they put him on injured reserve, in which case, if you have an IR spot, put him on IR, but see what happens that way. So I'm probably not, just because Olave is so talented and the Saints, he's the clear top wide receiver option on the team. The only one I'd consider is Downs, just if you need that immediate help to get you in the fantasy playoffs. If that's the thing of like you're borderline making it or not, you really need to make it. You need that wide receiver over these next 2 or 3 weeks. Then Downs would be the guy. But if you can wait and hold off and still use Olave potentially in the fantasy playoffs, I would want Olave for those matchups.
Gotcha. I think that's all the wide receiver. Or Joanna asks if we got any positive from Jalen Coker this Saturday. We were robbed, Joanna, of Jalen Coker this week, mixing in with Jonathan Mingo and company, but hopeful for dynasty at least. And then we'll get to Dak here when we maybe discuss the quarterbacks in a second. But we'll move on to the other positions. But first, I want to let you know that the show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Think of a time recently when you didn't feel like you could be your full self, like you were hiding behind a mask. October is the season for wearing masks and costumes, but some of us feel like we wear a mask more often than we want to at work and social settings around your family. I know it's not October anymore. We're into November, but we're still talking about the therapy can help us learn to accept all parts of ourselves, so you can take off the mask, because masks should be for Halloween fun, not for our emotions. Therapy can be really useful to get a better understanding of how your mind actually works and how to become more aware of your own patterns of behavior and how to improve them. It's useful for everybody, not just people struggling with something specific. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. BetterHelp is a convenient, flexible, and entirely online way to get therapy that's right for you. You just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. So visit betterhelp.com/PFFfantasy to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/PFFfantasy. All right, we are talking tight ends now, and where else would we start but the poster boy for waiver wire tight ends? Unless you're on MFL, where he's listed as a quarterback this season, which is dumb. All he did in Week 9 was rush 5 times for 19 yards and a touchdown, while adding 4 catches for 41 yards, and delivered his second top 5 fantasy finish of the year in just his 5th game. It's Taysom Hill time, Nate.
Yeah, it feels good to have him at the top of this list every week and have him finally pay off for anyone who took a chance on him. And K. Dotton as well had K. Dotton on this list earlier than most people did. It's the second tight end, and after week of like a random guy having a big week, still having these two at the top. So it feels good to have him here and hopefully not have him here much longer, because hopefully he will get picked up in enough leagues that we won't have to talk about him anymore. But Hill, the Saints are a mess in terms of all the players that they've had injured. Rashid Shaheed out for the season. Chris Olave, we don't know how long he will be out for. Running backs, they were down. Kendre Miller landed on injured reserve again. Jamal Williams was out for this game. So even though they've had all of these injuries at wide receiver, they still rarely used 11 personnel because they didn't have quite the trust in their wide receivers. They have a lot more trust in their tight ends, which meant Taysom Hill got to be on the field a decent amount, not just in the backfield, but also as a receiver. The one unknown here is they did fire their head coach, so they could very well change what they're doing a little bit, but I don't think they have much of an option to do anything else outside of have Hill be heavily involved in the offense. Even Jamal Williams, once he's back, he was getting phased out of the offense more than anything before his injury. So I think Hill should be the number 2 player in terms of carries on the team and continue to see some targets every week, which is not something he was consistently doing last season. And Alvin Kamara, he touched the ball more than he basically ever has at running back this past week. He has been touching the ball a lot. I don't know how sustainable that will be to get him the ball 30 times a game. So there is a chance that Kamara will have to see fewer touches in future games, in which case Hill might get more of those carries going forward. And they like using him at the red zone. That means lots of touchdowns potential at the very least. So I think Hill is definitely my top tight end option this week, and someone that I think can be in fantasy starting lineups when he's healthy, which is something that I've been saying for a couple months now, but it finally paid off again.
Yeah, no, nice. It'll be good, and hopefully we could get some more people believing in the wild card Taysom Hill, and maybe we'll even have him off the list at some point before the end of the season if he gets over that 50% rostership. And like you said, will be interesting to see how things go with Dennis Allen now fired, but Clint Kubiak still in place, so that likely will keep him valuable. And like you said, they don't really have a lot of other options, so makes sense that Taysom Hill continues to work in here. Next up, Hunter. Excuse me. Wow. Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots, a name we've discussed on and off this season on the Waiver Wire show, and clearly continues to have a role in that offense. He saw 8 targets, brought in 7 of them for a team-leading 56 receiving yards. Henry's looked really like the top receiving option for Drake May.
Yeah, he the past couple weeks has played well, started to win me over a little bit more. He's been someone over the past 2 years where his role has been very consistent. He's been the clear top receiving tight end for New England. They have pretty consistently, while he's been with the Patriots, had strong backup options at the position. It's Austin Hooper this year. So while Henry doesn't see a perfect amount of snaps for a fantasy tight end, it is still very strong compared to at least some of the other options. The big thing with him is he had a couple of big weeks, both last season and this season as well. But then the weeks that haven't been as good, he's only caught a pass or 2. So it's much harder to put him in your fantasy lineup because he can have those big games, but his bad games are typically worse than other tight ends' bad games. But he's strung together a couple of good games at this point, has been fairly consistently getting targeted. It seems like the Patriots have pretty well settled at who their top 3 wide receivers are, and they aren't necessarily seeing a lot of targets. It's Henry who seems to be the top target in the offense over these past couple weeks. And the schedule isn't perfect, but they still have some pretty favorable matchups for tight ends, games against the Bengals, Panthers, and Dolphins. So maybe not someone that I'm consistently putting in my fantasy lineup over the rest of the season, but I think when the matchup is right, I would be comfortable putting him in my lineup.
Yeah, like you said, he leads the team in targets with 50. He leads them in receiving yards, 414 on the year, and he's tied for the team lead in receiving touchdowns with one. So maybe he could be the first receiving option in New England to break that 8-way tie so far this season. We'll see, but yeah, not a bad option there at tight end in Hunter Henry. Will Dissly is back for a third straight week. I know not the most productive game for him this week for the Los Angeles Chargers, but still a relevant role for him in this offense, kind of worth targeting in deeper leagues, Nate.
Yeah, he has played well in 2 of his last 3 games. And the big thing here is Hayden Hurst, who was the receiving tight end to start the season, which is why Disley's snaps were so low earlier at times this season. Hurst was back from his injury this week, but only played a couple of snaps. It was still Will Dissly getting the vast majority of the routes. Clear majority of the snaps compared to usual. So again, not a player that has a perfect role in the offense, still gets rotated out a decent amount at tight end. But the big thing is this coaching staff has a strong history of throwing 2 tight ends in their offense. We saw that the 2 weeks prior to Will Dissly. So I think there is a chance that Dissly continues to have a large role in this offense going forward.
Gotcha. And then Chico Okonkwo also makes the list again. We talked about how there are, I guess, limited receiving options in Tennessee, and Okonkwo could be one of those options again if the offense can get going at some point here. It was third on the team, I think, in receiving production this week, and could very well be second or first on the team if things continue to go well for him and his playing time continues to increase here.
Yeah, someone that we've included for a couple weeks now, largely because of the Titans' schedule being so rough at the start of the season and looking very good over the rest of the season. The big thing here is Okonkwo was rotating with Josh Wiley in passing situations early in the season, and now they seem very comfortable with Okonkwo being their clear lead receiving tight end. Took a big jump in playing time this week. Ran by far the most routes among the tight ends, while in the past there's been more of that rotation. So a lot of guys pretty similar. Nick Bennett also part of that rotation, but it's Okonkwo ran a lot more routes than both of the other tight ends this past week. So Titans play Jacksonville twice, the Bengals, the Colts from weeks 14 to week 17, all very favorable matchups for tight ends, all among 4 of the 10 worst teams at allowing fantasy points to tight ends this season. So very good matchups for him. So with this mix of playing time and good matchups, that could lead to some productive games over the rest of the season.
Yeah, I mean, I know I might even have to start him this week. I know Brock Bowers obviously on a bye week. Dallas Goedert, we'll see what happens. Like there's going to be times where maybe a Chico Okonkwo is the best option, and I know he might be for me at least in one league this week. So last tight end to cover here is so for some Canadian representation on the list, Theo Johnson of the New York Giants. He found the end zone to go along with 51 yards. I think we could get more out of this young Canuck, Theo Johnson, Nate.
Yeah, but I think I want to go over the trade that just broke, and we can talk about Theo Johnson after.
What is it?
The Cowboys traded for Jonathan Mingo.
Oh,
so
hey.
The question is: there good news about Jalen Coker? There was not on Sunday, but there is today.
Yes.
So Jonathan Mingo going to the Cowboys. Mingo has been the clear 4th wide receiver for Carolina these past couple weeks, even with the injuries with Deontay Johnson being out for a little bit, and now he's traded. With Adam Thielen being out, we saw Jalen Coker end up with more playing time. Even David Moore, a journeyman wide receiver who has been with the coaching staff for a couple years now, seeing a lot of playing time. So this kind of opens the door for Coker to potentially see more playing time. I would say the only concerning thing is this might make it a little less likely that Adam Thielen gets traded. I think still a chance, especially if they're going all in on this rebuilding mode, then that means that Coker could be the clear slot receiver over the rest of the season. But we'll see if over these next couple hours if Adam Thielen gets traded. Good news for Mingo. I think definitely an opportunity to see playing time in Dallas. Probably not the best news for Brandon Cook's potential to return in the future. This is probably just as much a long-term play for Dallas as it is a short-term. I don't know how much they're trying to win this year, but if Mingo is someone that they have been high on and he is still a young receiver, it makes sense to trade for a young receiver that you like coming out of college, regardless of if you're trying to win this year or not. So would definitely expect Mingo. I think he'll have an opportunity to earn playing time. Not sure if it'll be enough playing time and enough targets to want to start him in fantasy, because CeeDee Lamb is still going to be the number one. Jake Ferguson is still going to get a lot of targets. I still have trust in Jalen Tolbert. The only reason that Tolbert was not on this list is because Dak Prescott, the news that he is likely going to land on injured reserve. So not sure how much fantasy value Mingo will necessarily have this season, but at least he has a higher chance of having fantasy value this season than he did prior to the trade.
Yeah, and I think for, Dallas as well, like you said, if they liked him, during the draft process or whatever, weren't able to get him, it makes more sense to kind of trade for than like an Adam Thielen, especially with Dak landing on IR. They're likely not going to be in position here to really compete. It seems like, especially where they're at in the standings. So why not take a swing on somebody for the future that maybe can develop into a wide receiver too for that team if possible. But yeah, like we said, we like Tolbert as well. We've covered him in recent weeks, but yeah, this Dallas offense, not great. And then Carolina, I mean, yeah, nice to see, obviously, for Jalen Coker as Jonathan Mingo. Maybe he was only working into so they could showcase him a little bit. Who knows? But maybe there's some upside here with Jalen Coker again going forward. But just quickly, the tight ends, and speaking of Carolina too, Jatavian Sanders had a really nice game as well, Nate. Any interest in him as a potential waiver wire target here? I know we've talked about him previously, but not on the list this week. Any reason to be kind of concerned about him as a potential target?
Yeah. First off, it was good to see him have that good game. The two concerns there: one, the Panthers' schedule isn't nearly as nice for tight ends as some of these guys that we're talking about. And two, Tommy Trumbull has still been a heavy part of the tight end rotation when he's been healthy. In weeks, I think it was 3 or 4 or so, we saw Trumbull play over 80% of the offensive snaps. So even though Sanders was the starter at the beginning of the season, Sanders saw a significant dip in playing time in those weeks. Then Trumbull has missed time again. We saw Sanders have a good week. I think it was week 6. Trumbull was back in week 7. Trumbull went back to being the starter. Sanders went back to seeing a dip in playing time. So there is a sense that, hey, Sanders just had a really good game. Ideally, he remains a starter. That's what I personally would like to see. But we also saw Sanders have a good game in week 6 and go back to being the number 2 tight end in a rotation. So that's a big thing for me, is I think it's going to be more of a rotation. So if I do have a spot where I'm trying to get a young tight end who is coming off a good game, I would try to stick with Theo Johnson, who was targeted 6 times this past week, had the second most targets among the team, caught 3 passes, 51 yards and a touchdown. Throughout the season has been seeing more than enough routes run to be a fantasy starter. It's just his target share hasn't been nearly high enough. It has increased significantly this week, so a chance it remains high going forward. And the Giants have one of the best schedules for a passing offense over the rest of the season.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that one. And then let's go on to our final position here. But first, a quick word from our friends at Fabric by Gerber Life. There are some things school doesn't really teach you, like how to handle the financial world, or that you have to plan for a successful future later. And that includes for your kids. Fabric makes it easy for you to set up an investment account for your child now that grows with them and helps prepare for their financial future. Fabric by Gerber Life was designed by parents for parents to make it easy to plan for and manage your family's financial path. With a kid's investment account from Fabric, you can start investing in your child's future today. While your kids can't invest when they're minors, a UGMA kids investment account allows you to invest on their behalf now and gives their investments more time to grow. Funds can be used for nearly anything benefiting your child, from tuition and books to summer camps and after school activities. And when they're adults, they can use the funds for their first home, new car, or even to start a business. It's all online, and setting up an account could take you just 5 minutes. Get started investing with as little as $1 a day, then manage your child's account and monitor the investments right from your phone. There are no contribution limits, multiple tax advantages, and their SIPC insured up to $500,000, plus no commission fees and just a low flat monthly maintenance fee. Join the thousands of parents who trust Fabric to help protect their family. Start investing in your child today at meetfabric.com/fantasy. That's meetfabric.com/fantasy, MEET fabric.com/fantasy. This is a paid promotion for the Fabric UGMA product and not for the investment advisory services. Portfolios managed by Fort Washington Investment Advisors, Inc. Custodial services provided by Apex Clearing Corporation. All investing is subject to risk. Terms apply. Learn more at meetfabric.com. All right. Lastly, our quarterbacks are up next, and we'll start with Justin Herbert of the Los Angeles Chargers. We'll get to the quarterback questions probably just at the end here. But Justin Herbert available in just over 50% of ESPN leagues, Nate, and looking good out there lately.
Yeah, he has completely turned his season around. The Chargers were one of the most run-heavy teams. He was not grading well, clearly the worst grades of his career to start the season. And then these last couple weeks has really turned things around. The team is passing the ball more often. The receivers are playing well. Lad McConkey's done well. We talked about Quentin Johnston as well, Will Disley. So it's looked very good for Herbert. So very excited for him. I think he's someone that I would probably put him in my fantasy starting lineup, very much dependent on the matchup. Over the next 6 weeks, they have games against the Bengals, Ravens, and Chiefs for 3 of their matchups. So I think that is 3 weeks where Herbert could very well be ranking among the top 12 fantasy quarterbacks those weeks, someone to put in your lineup then. So I'm perfectly happy to pick him up if you're on a team that you've been rotating your quarterback. If you, of course, have someone like Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen, probably don't need him, but a lot of other teams, it's fine to start your quarterback depending on who they're facing.
Yeah, he's obviously a really good NFL quarterback. We know this. It wasn't translating to fantasy early in the year, but we're seeing it a little more here in back-to-back weeks. So would definitely be nice to kind of keep that going. And then Tua Tagovailoa is up next, also available in just over 50% of ESPN leagues. Was a better fantasy game for him this week, and just a better game all around. Only 3 incompletions in a tougher matchup against the Bills, even despite Jalen Waddle posting negative receiving yardage in this one. So liking Tua Tagovailoa for the rest of the season, Nate.
Oh, yeah, I got 231 yards, 2 touchdowns. That was good to see. Another guy that I'd be comfortable starting, just depending on the matchup, has some opportunities to build some momentum these next few weeks. Faces the Rams, the Raiders, the Patriots, all teams where the Dolphins could potentially be winning those games. Maybe that means they end up running the ball more, which might not be the greatest thing for Tua's fantasy value, but hopefully can throw some passing touchdowns before they start running the ball more. During the fantasy playoffs, 2 favorable matchups against the Texans and Browns, 2 teams that have allowed a decent amount of fantasy points to quarterbacks this season. So another player who you're probably not putting him in your starting lineup every single week over the rest of the year, but can be a rotational guy. So particularly between those 2, I think we're even at a point in the season where it's fine looking ahead at the schedule, trying to figure out who's going to be your starting quarterback each week and maybe picking which one you want off the waiver wire, depending on when you need a better starting quarterback.
Gotcha. And then Daniel Jones of the New York Giants also on the list this week. He's been an enigma of an NFL quarterback at times, it feels like, but every once in a while he delivers a high-end fantasy performance like he did this past week. And part of that has to do with his rushing ability as well, Nate.
Yeah, for a while was stuck at having more touchdown passes than passing yards in this game. So that's always fun when statistical things like that happen. But through 2 touchdowns, ran for 1. I have been including Jones for a while on this list because of his schedule over the rest of the season, have included a number of his pass catchers on this list for the same reason. With Jones, it's important to note, and this game was a good reminder, that he is one of the better rushing quarterbacks in the NFL. There are a couple that are clearly ahead of him that run far more often and are more efficient running the ball, but he is definitely in that next tier of rushers in terms of how frequently he runs the ball. And that is very helpful for a quarterback's fantasy production. So even when he hasn't been the best starting quarterback in the league, he's at least consistently been among the top 20 fantasy quarterbacks for that rushing floor. And he threw the 2 touchdowns in this game. He has some good young receivers who ideally will continue to play better over the rest of the season. And it's the best schedule for quarterbacks over the rest of the season. Each of their next 3 opponents are in the top 6 at allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks. During the fantasy playoffs, all 3 in the top 11 at allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks. So very good matchups for Jones and the passing offense for the rest of the way.
Yeah, I mean, look, he's got that rushing potential. Like you said, he even outrushed Jaden Daniels in this game. Had more rushing yards. Obviously, had the rushing touchdown. Even threw a couple touchdowns at home, which he hadn't done in over that 600-day span or whatever it was that they kept bringing up. So Russell Wilson of the Pittsburgh Steelers is up next. He's looked pretty good in his 2 starts, Nate, and it's translating to fantasy as well.
Oh yeah, has put up a lot of production. They had their bye week this past week, so didn't do anything this week. But it seems like he's going to remain the starting quarterback for Pittsburgh going forward, which is unfortunate for those of you who trusted Justin Fields. But Russell Wilson is throwing the ball, and I think Pittsburgh will be another interesting team to watch over the rest of the day. It sounds like they have been trying to trade for a wide receiver for a couple of months now, so it would be good if they are able to land someone. Definitely depends a lot on how good of a wide receiver they are able to get. I think there's a wide variety of wide receivers they could be trying to trade for today, but that could very well help the offense as well going forward. Over the next 7 weeks, the Steelers have 2 matchups against the Baltimore Ravens, 1 against the Bengals. Those should be 3 high-scoring games where the teams are passing the ball a lot. A bunch of teams who are very good at stopping the run, not as good at stopping the pass. So I think Wilson is capable of putting up a lot of fantasy points in those matchups as well. So just another guy who you could be considering in your starting lineup, depending on who he's facing.
Yeah, no, he's been solid. Like you said, 3 touchdowns on the year, no interceptions, just 1 turnover worthy play. So not too shabby so far for Russell Wilson. Okay, last name on the list here, and then we'll get to a couple quarterback questions. It's Bryce Young of the Carolina Panthers, and really nice to see him playing well here, and obviously getting the win this week. But maybe could be some fantasy usage to take advantage of here with Bryce Young down the stretch, Nate.
Yeah, not 100% that he will remain the starter. It seems like the Panthers were non-committal to start the week. If they do go back to Andy Dalton, then I would put Andy Dalton here. This is basically a pick up a Carolina Panthers quarterback because the schedule does look nice over the rest of the year. Face the Cowboys, Cardinals, and Buccaneers in the fantasy playoffs, 3 of the top 7 teams at allowing fantasy points to quarterbacks. That is the best schedule for quarterbacks in the fantasy playoffs. And the Panthers probably need to be passing the ball a lot in those games, even though they aren't necessarily the best opponents in the world. There are some decent opponents there. You could argue average teams, so still teams where the Panthers will likely be losing and having to throw. So I think Young or Dalton, whoever's starting, could end up with a lot of fantasy points in those games. So probably you'll be pretty stressed if you're starting them in the fantasy playoffs, but a chance that it pays off.
There you go. All right. So we do have a couple questions about at least a couple names here that aren't on the list this week. And this one from Will Power. Amazing name, by the way. Fellow Canadian apparently as well. So Will Power asks, Cooper Rush or Jameis Winston rest of season? Thinking about putting in a small bid for Cooper Rush as his 4th quarterback. We just saw the news that Dak Prescott's going to be placed on injured reserve and will be out for at least the next 4 games. So any interest in the Cowboys quarterback or Jameis here as a potential waiver target?
I would go with Winston. The reason he's not here is because of that schedule is very rough for the Browns, but we have seen Winston be a fantasy starter at times in his career where Cooper or Rush, we have seen him as a starting quarterback before. He hasn't put up a ton of production, even though he is going to be the starter in the immediate future. Would not be entirely surprised if they give Trey Lance a shot at some point, considering they traded for him. So also not 100% confident Rush will remain the starter for the rest of the way. So probably near the bottom of my rankings for quarterbacks for the rest of the season. I should check their schedule because that's one that I do not have memorized off the top of my head. So I'm guessing it's right around league average. Actually, it is a fairly good schedule for Dallas the rest of the way at quarterback. So Rush might be worth considering depending on how well he plays and how healthy the receivers are. But there's at least a chance that Rush could have some production in some of these games going forward, but probably still sticking with Winston, just valuing the quality of the quarterback more so than the schedule between those two.
Gotcha. And then Will did ask too, like if you'd have Bryce Young over both of them, I guess. And we had Bryce Young on the list this week. The other 2 were not. So Bryce Young's over both, if you could.
I think so. Yeah.
Okay. Cool. And I think, and there was one other question just from TM. Does Dak landing on IR hurt Rico Dowdle's value? So obviously, this is probably more to do with the offense not being as efficient here. We expect anyways with Cooper Rush or whoever at quarterback. But any concern for Rico Dowdle?
Oh, yeah. Concerns about the entire offense because of it. At least Dowdle is still the clear starting running back, but a higher chance that they fall behind in games, which means a higher chance that they abandon the run earlier in games. So that's the main concern with Dowdle. Maybe a slightly higher chance that teams are stacking the box against him, but I still think if I'm a defense, I'm more worried about the passing game than I am Dowdle. So it's mostly game script related and how much Dallas will be winning versus losing games and how much they're running in those situations. That has me concerned specifically for Dowdle.
Yeah, and they already weren't winning a lot, so we'll see. If losing their starting quarterback makes that matters worse here, but that's pretty much going to do it for this week. So thank you all very much for tuning in. Make sure to get those waiver targets and waiver wire claims in. Yeah, Nate, thank you as always for putting this list together. Before we go and monitor the trade mill here until 4 o'clock, please do remind everybody what you have going on over at pff.com to help them win their leagues.
Sure. As usual, I have the recap for all of the games this past weekend up already. The top 10 recap went up yesterday. The waiver wire article, which covers everything we talked about here. If there are some major trades that impact how things end up, I will try to keep the article up to date. So if there are trades that could end up impacting waivers, I will try to update that there. Today had rest of season rankings go up. As well as the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high. I will get the rankings up this afternoon. It might be slightly later than usual. I will be voting shortly after this. If you are in the United States, please vote today. And with all the trades that could happen, that could delay when the rankings go out, because every time there's a trade, I have to change all the shares for everyone and change where people are in the rankings and everything like that. So that could impact when rankings are going out today as well, but they will be going up at some point this afternoon. After that, we'll have start sit on Thursday and then the usual Thursday night recap. And we'll note with the 5 to add, 5 to drop, 5 to buy low, 5 to sell high, that a lot of leagues do have their trade deadlines next week, later in the week. So I will only have one more version of that article next week. So just remember, if you are trying to make trades in your leagues, you probably have about 2 weeks to do so, but you should be able to find whenever the trade deadline is in your league settings. So definitely check that out so you know and are able to plan accordingly.
Yeah. I like it. As for me, I'll have the IDP fantasy report out shortly today, followed by the wide receiver man zone coverage report again on Thursday, IDP rankings, O-line, D-line matchups to target and avoid. And then we're back in the podcast feed doing the week 10 IDP preview, as well as the week 10 start sit show with Nick Bodiford. So be sure to check those out as well. And until next time, peace out.